Hello everybody, welcome back to Raptors Report. I'm your host Julian. Now today we're going to be doing something a little different because the past couple of weeks I have been making deep dive content on different Raptors players. I made one for RJ Barrett, I made one for Grady Dick, and both of the links will be available in the description if you want to check them out, which I recommend. But today we're going to be looking at some statistics. In fact, 3 statistics that I've picked out that I think are very interesting and have implications on what could happen with the Toronto Raptors this coming season. Now, without any further ado, why don't we just jump right in? And the first point is that the Toronto Raptors need to be better above the break 3-point shooters. Now, as I've mentioned in my other videos, above the break 3-point shots are one of the easiest shots for an offense to create. One of the reasons for this is because there's a lot of space along the top of the 3-point arc. And another reason is that teams are explicitly looking to stop teams from taking corner 3-point shots. And the reason for this is because 3-point shots from the corner are the shortest and easiest of all the 3-point shots to make. And they often are set shots, because a player generally doesn't really move around much. A lot of the time you will have a player camped in the corner waiting for a kick-out pass to make an open catch-and-shoot 3-point shot from the corner, which is one of the best shots you can take in the NBA. And as a result, they're more willing to give up shots from above the break. Now, the Toronto Raptors took this shot quite a bit last season, but unfortunately for them, they were dead last in terms of above the break 3-point percentage. The Toronto Raptors took 24.2 above the break 3-point shots, but they only shot 34% on those types of shots, which was, as I mentioned, dead last. Contrast that with the number of corner 3-point shots that the Toronto Raptors took, which was in the bottom half of the league in terms of number of attempts at 8.8. And they shot a lot better there, 37.7%, but still within the bottom 10, but at least not dead last. And really what this tells me is that they were not getting good enough guard play and not good enough creation as a whole on the team. And there's 2 reasons for that. A lot of the time, corner 3-point shots are a function of how much pressure you can put on your opponent's defense, because teams will only concede an open 3-point shot in the corner if they really need to collapse their defense to stop a drive or stop a scoring opportunity, or if they're in a scramble because they had a lot of defensive coverages that they needed to move around. So unless you're making a team move off of that corner 3-point shot, it's going to be pretty bottled up. So if you're not taking a lot of those shots, you're probably not getting enough creation. A second reason why perhaps you would not be able to make a lot of above the break 3s is also probably because you don't have a very good pull-up 3-point shooter. Pull-up 3-point shooters are a lot of the time guards, primary ball handlers, who will use the ability, if they're not being covered, to just, pull up and take an open shot. That happens a lot in transition, a lot off of screen and rolls. And unfortunately for the Toronto Raptors, they had a player named Dennis Schroeder last season who has his strengths and weaknesses, but is pretty obviously not a starting caliber NBA point guard. And one of the reasons is because he is not a good pull-up 3-point shooter. And if he is going to be taking pull-up 3-point shots from above the arc, he's not going to be making a lot of them. And that's one of the reasons why. Another reason why is because one of their main shooters, Grady Dick, was not a good above the break 3-point shooter. And when you dig into the stats like I did with my last video, even in the second half of the season when he shot a lot better, he was making a lot of those shots from the corners and not from above the break, where he remained not very good. So if you have 2 of your main shooters not being very good from above the break, you, as a team, your percentages are going to be pretty low. So in order to improve that, the Toronto Raptors need to have better on-ball shooting, and they need to be better shooters when they come off of screens. So those are 2 things that the Raptors can do in order to improve above the break 3-point percentage. And there are some reasons to be optimistic. For example, the Toronto Raptors have replaced Dennis Schroeder with Immanuel Quickley. And one of Immanuel Quickley's biggest strengths is his ability to hit pull-up 3s, take a lot of them and make a lot of them. That's probably his main strength as a player. And so if you take one of the worst starting point guards in the league in terms of the ability to pull up and hit shots and replace him with one of the better pull-up shooters in the NBA, you're going to see a big difference. Another reason perhaps to be optimistic is that Grady Dick did not shoot very well when he came off of screens above the break last season, but with another season under his belt, perhaps he will improve in that category, and then you won't have two guards who are not good at it. But when you look at reasons to be pessimistic, there is a reason. In fact, one of the players that the Toronto Raptors lost this offseason was Gary Trent Jr. And one of Gary Trent Jr.'s strengths as a player was his ability to catch and shoot and also create shots above the break and hit those threes. So losing him might sting a little bit more than you might expect. Number 2, in terms of statistics, is that the Toronto Raptors need to be more active on defense. And there are 4 sub-points here, the first of which is that the Toronto Raptors were second worst in terms of opponent offensive rebounding. The second sub-point is that the Toronto Raptors fouled the 3rd least in the NBA. Number 3 is that the Toronto Raptors had the 4th worst opponent estimated field goal percentage. And the last point in this last sub-point was that the Toronto Raptors were bottom 10 in terms of contested shots. So all of these kind of work together to paint a similar picture. The first of which is that the Toronto Raptors perhaps were not as active defensively as you would have hoped. If you are giving up a lot of offensive rebounds, there could be 2 culprits, and I think both came into play. The first of which is that you're not trying hard enough. You're not boxing out, you're not active enough, you're not really going and getting the ball. And rebounding a lot of the time is a who wants it stat and a who wants it metric. Because players who have with big hearts and a lot of effort and are willing to go and do it get rebounds. And if you're not motivated, if you're not willing to go and get it, you're not going to out-rebound another team. And another reason for that is because the Toronto Raptors were pretty small for a significant portion of the season, mainly due to injury. Jakob Poeltl, who's their starting center and a good defensive rebounder, was injured for a substantial portion of the season. On top of that, after the trade, Scotty Barnes was also injured for a substantial portion of the season. So when those 2 players are out of commission, it's not going to look too hot for your defensive rebounding, keeping other teams off of the boards. The next subpoint is that the Toronto Raptors had the 3rd fewest fouls committed. And in some cases, you would assume that this is actually a positive stat. Keeping other teams off of the line is usually good. Not getting into the bonus is a good thing. And for teams that are very good defensively, that is a positive stat. For example, the Boston Celtics had the least number of fouls committed. On the other hand, if you are not stopping other teams, it can be a metric that points to not a lot of defensive activity and not trying very hard. And the Raptors were not very good defensively, so that kind of points to the fact that maybe they just weren't putting in enough effort. That goes very hand in hand with the next point, which is that the Toronto Raptors were the 4th worst team in terms of opponent estimated field goal percentage. So other teams shot very well against the Toronto Raptors. And if you combine the prior point where they're not fouling very much with the fact that the other team is shooting such a high percentage, it really just begs the question, like, what are you doing essentially on defense? Are you putting in enough effort? And the last subpoint, which is kind of the nail in the coffin here, is that the Toronto Raptors were bottom 10 in terms of the number of contested shots that they gave up. They did not contest many shots. Teams were shooting open shots. It was free and easy. And if you as a team are giving up that many shots, you're not going to be a good defensive team. They were simply not doing enough to stop other teams from scoring. And there are a couple of reasons to be optimistic, the first of which is that the Toronto Raptors hopefully will be healthier this season. They were missing their best shot blocker and rim protector and rebounder in Jakob Poeltl for a significant portion of the season with a hand injury. And also Scotty Barnes was injured toward the end of the season. And with those 2 players playing and healthy, there should be an uptick in terms of defense and rim protection and rebound. However, it can't just fall to those 2 players. I think that you really need to have a full buy-in. And in terms of full buy-in, the Raptors should have a full training camp this season and be able to integrate all of the players that they acquired last season and during the summer and perhaps become more of a cohesive unit. Because last season there were a lot of different looks, a lot of different starting lineups and different configurations. It was kind of a mess. And hopefully with a full training camp under their belts, they will be a better defensive team. There are a couple reasons to be pessimistic though. They don't really have a lockdown wing or perimeter defender. Davion Mitchell is purported to be one. He's had some less than stellar defensive statistics, especially last season, but I think perhaps he could be called on. Ochai Agbaji is a good defender, but perhaps his offense and his shooting might limit his ability to stay on the floor. They don't really have a guy like OG Anunoby, who you could reliably put out there on their best perimeter player and really lock guys down. And the final point, the final statistic, is that the Toronto Raptors really need to execute better on offense. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So the Toronto Raptors, their top 3 plays in terms of the amounts of shots that they took, the first of which was spot-up shooting. They took 24% of their shot attempts in terms of spot-up shooting. So that means catch and shoot, that means getting the ball kicked out to you, that means you're a standstill shooter taking a shot. They were top 10 in the number of spot-up shots that they took in the league. The second most possessions that they used were in transition. They took 21% of their shots in transition, which is a good figure for a young team with a lot of athletic and competent transition players. So that's something I hope continues. And the third most shots that they took were from the ball handler in the pick and roll. They used 13% of their possessions with the pick and roll ball handler, which was very low comparatively with the rest of the league. I believe it was third least in the league, but it was still a significant portion of their offense. Now, the one that sticks out the most is the transition play by the Toronto Raptors. They had the most transition possessions of any team in the NBA this past season, which is a good stat. I think for the Toronto Raptors, they have a distinct advantage in terms of their youth, their legs, their athleticism. They are a team that want to get out and run. And so I think it's a positive sign that they did that as much as they did this past season. Unfortunately, being first in that category in terms of the number of times they did it, they were about middle of the pack in terms of points per possession. So that's a place that they need to improve. If you are going to be going out and getting out in transition, you want to be able to convert those opportunities. And I think that they should be a lot better. They have the finishers, they have the guys that should be able to finish transition opportunities, but for whatever reason, they were about middle of the pack last season. Second, the possession that they used the most was spot-up shooting. They were top 10 in the league in terms of the number of spot-up shots that they took, but they were in the bottom 10 in terms of points per possession. And that's not really a surprise. The Toronto Raptors didn't have a lot of shooting last year. And hopefully that is not the case this season, and hopefully they do have enough shooting at the guard positions that they are able to knock down their spot-up shots. The third most used possession type for the Raptors was the pick-and-roll ball handler using a possession. That accounted for about 14% of the shots that they took. And that wasn't very much in the grand scheme of things compared to other teams. They took the third fewest of any team in the league, but they were absolutely terrible, and in fact, the worst team in the league at making that shot, scoring only 0.8 points per possession, which was the worst in the league. So they have a lot of ground to make up there. And there's a good reason for that. For the majority of the season, their starting point guard was Dennis Schroeder, who, while he has his strengths and weaknesses as a player, is clearly not a starting caliber NBA point guard. And to compound that, he was actually very poor at running the pick and roll. So those two factors combined means that the Toronto Raptors were running a play that did not work for them very well. And while compared to other teams, they didn't take very many of those types of shots, it was the third most run play that they had this season, and it was not effective. So in a nutshell, their top 3 plays that they ran were below average in terms of points per possession. So that really just goes to show that they did not execute very well. And there are a couple reasons to be optimistic about their chances in improving in those categories in the coming season. Not the least of which is the fact that they will have better point guard play, which I mentioned earlier. Dennis Schroeder being replaced by Emmanuel Quickley, who should be able to generate better looks for himself in the pick and roll, is a reason that you could be optimistic. Also, the Toronto Raptors lost Gary Trent Jr., and while that'll hurt their shooting, it won't hurt them when it comes to transition play, because Gary Trent Jr. was a very poor transition player He did not like to pass the ball when he was on the break, and when he did take a shot, it did not go in very often, especially contested layups. He was very poor at that, and a lot of the time that is what's going to happen in transition. There will be one man back, and you'll have to beat that man either through a pass or by making a contested layup, and he wasn't very good at either of those. On the flip side, there are some reasons to be pessimistic as well. Emmanuel Quickley replacing Dennis Schroeder, and Grady Dick having perhaps a better season in his second year could help them with shooting. But outside of those two, and perhaps Kelly Olynyk, there isn't a great three-point shooter. So spot up, catch and shoot, there might be some issues there. And another reason to be pessimistic is that the bench doesn't really have a good pick and roll ball handler. They brought in Davion Mitchell. He's the consensus guy to be the backup point guard. And unfortunately, he's not really an on-ball guard. He's more of an off-ball guard. He can catch and shoot, but I don't think you really want him running too many pick and rolls. And unfortunately for the Toronto Raptors, they don't have a plethora of options to go to be the backup point guard or the backup guy who's going to be using screens and getting into the paint. And that's really what you need if you want to improve your ability to shoot the ball out of the pick and roll. I mean, if that's your third most used shot type, Emmanuel Quickley's going to help with that, but you're going to need some other players to step up and do better. So there's still a question mark there, especially off the bench. And that kind of wraps things up. So to recount the 3 stats that we used today, the first of which was the Raptors have to get better at shooting above the break. Number 2, the Toronto Raptors have to be more active on defense. And number 3, the Toronto Raptors have to execute better on the plays that they run a lot of. And I hope that that was illuminating for you. I learned some things when I dug into the stats, and I think there are some real reasons to be optimistic heading into this coming season. So I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Do you think that I did a good job covering the bases there? Are there different conclusions you can draw from the stats that I gave you? And are there any interesting stats that you have seen that might play a factor in the season to come? Please let me know here in the comments, and also on Twitter, where you can reach me at Raptors Report. I'm always very interested in hearing what other Raptors fans have to say. And as always, thank you for tuning in to Raptors Report, your source for in-depth Raptors content.